I used to be an employee of a small restaurant in the city, and on quiet nights, when there were fewer customers, I would take up extra shifts delivering food. Most of the time, the deliveries were pretty uneventful, but one rainy night delivery changed everything for me forever. I remember that night clearly. It was pouring rain, with thunder and lightning filling the sky. I received an order to deliver food to a remote area near some old railroad tracks. It didn't seem too strange, as I sometimes had to deliver to secluded locations. However, what caught my attention was the name of the customer. It was just a single word, Dan. No specific address, no contact number, just a brief instruction. Delivered to the 4th train car at the abandoned warehouse. Even though it seemed odd, the tips for these hard-to-find locations were usually generous, so I decided to go. I drove through flooded streets, making my way to a long-abandoned industrial area, overrun with weeds and wild bushes. As I arrived, the rusty old train tracks stretched out in front of me, leading to a train that sat there, covered in rust and surrounded by overgrown grass. The train cars loomed in the rain like ghostly figures. An eerie chill ran down my spine as I approached. I pulled my car over, turned off the engine, and grabbed the food bag. I took out my phone to try and call for confirmation, but there was no signal. With no other choice, I stepped out, trying to locate the 4th train car. As instructed, each step I took splashed water up around my shoes, echoing loudly in the silent, rain-soaked night. I counted each train car as I moved forward. 1, 2, 3, until I finally stopped in front of the 4th car, my heart racing. The heavy iron door was slightly ajar, and inside, it was pitch dark. I looked around but saw no one. "Hello, is anyone here?" I called out. No one responded. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe the customer had gone inside to get out of the rain, I thought, and stepped inside the train car. The interior of the train car was completely empty, except for an old wooden table in the middle and a single chair. On the table was a dimly lit flashlight and a small piece of paper. My wet shoes squeaked as I cautiously approached the table. The paper was scribbled with a shaky hand. "Thank you for coming. Leave the food here and don't turn around. Exit the same way you came." A sense of unease filled my chest. Who would play such a creepy joke? I turned around, planning to leave, but a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. The sound of footsteps, faint and slow, coming from a dark corner of the train car. I spun around and squinted into the darkness, my heart pounding wildly. A figure stood there, half hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out the face, only that it was a person, standing still like a statue, staring directly at me. The air became thick and suffocating, and every hair on my body stood on end. Are you Dan?" I stammered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, just remained motionless. Suddenly, I noticed something in his hand. A long object, something like a metal rod.
"What do you want?"
I took a step back, trying to maintain distance. But he moved suddenly, charging toward me with terrifying speed. I threw the bag of food on the ground and bolted out of the train car. His footsteps pounded behind me, the sound of metal scraping against the train floor, screeching loudly. I jumped off the train car and sprinted down the tracks, toward my car. He kept chasing, screaming angrily through the rain.
"Stop. Do you think you can escape?"
At that moment, I could only run, not daring to look back. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed. A gunshot. A bullet whizzed past my ear, embedding itself into the train car ahead. I didn't think, didn't feel, just ran. I jumped into my car, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas pedal. The tires skidded on the wet road before speeding off into the darkness. This story would have ended there if I hadn't gone back a month later. This time with a friend named Arthur, who worked as a security guard. I needed to know who that person was and why he acted so violently. We returned during daylight, armed with a metal baton for protection. When we arrived, I was shocked to see that the train was still there. But what was strange was that all the train cars I had seen before were now covered with filthy white tarps, as if someone was trying to hide something inside. We approached the fourth car, the one I had been chased out of that night. The door was still open, and Arthur and I stepped inside, batons ready. The interior was the same, except for one new addition. A large wooden box placed right in the middle of the car, next to some loose chains. I bent down to open the lid and nearly vomited at what I saw inside. A doll with its face torn apart, its body wrapped in barbed wire and metal cables. Just then, we heard footsteps outside. I stood up quickly, eyes locked on the door. A figure was standing there, this time in broad daylight, clear and terrifying. He wore a hat that covered his face, holding a gun in his hand.
Back again,
he hissed. Without thinking, Arthur and I bolted out the other side of the train car and ran. We didn't stop until we were sure we were far enough away. Since that day, I've never returned to those tracks, and every time I think about that wooden box and the tortured doll inside, I shudder, wondering if I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could ever imagine. I'm a person who likes to explore. I like to explore strange and sometimes weird things. I used to have a rather rebellious youth and liked doing risky things that now, looking back, seem incredibly dangerous. One of those risky experiences was my passion for climbing and exploring abandoned places, especially old trains where no one dared to go at night. It was the place where I felt free and could release all the tension in my life. One summer night, after years of abandoning this habit, I decided to revisit an old train station that I once explored with friends. The station is located deep in a deserted forest, near an abandoned industrial area. From what I remembered, the station housed an old train that had been out of service for decades, with rusted carriages and broken windows, creating an eerie and haunting scene. I planned to drive there, walk through the forest, and climb into the train as I used to. Everything seemed quite simple, but I had no idea that night would be the last time I dared to get close to that place. I arrived at the location around 10 p.m., carrying a flashlight and a small knife for protection. There was no phone signal in the area, and dense trees covered the entire path leading to the abandoned station. The faint moonlight filtered through the treetops, casting ghostly shadows dancing along the trail. As I approached the station, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The station emerged dimly in the moonlight, along with the long and gloomy train. Its metal frames rusted and its windows shattered. I stood at the entrance of the station, looking up, trying to calm myself. It's just your imagination. There's nothing here, I told myself. But my footsteps were still slow and cautious. I climbed over a locked iron gate and made my way to the first carriage. The heavy iron door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The smell of mold and rust hit my nose, and the cold air sent a chill down my spine. I began to move through the train, the flashlight illuminating rows of broken seats and windows covered in a thick layer of dust. When I reached the middle of the carriage, a strange sound echoed. Light footsteps coming from the other end of the train. I froze, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. The footsteps stopped immediately. I shined my flashlight in that direction, but saw nothing. "Is someone there?" I shouted, hoping it was just an animal or the wind. There was no response. After a few moments of silence, I decided to keep moving. But every time I took a step, the footsteps followed. I walked faster, and the footsteps quickened. I stopped, and the footsteps stopped too. Fear began to rise, cold sweat soaking through my shirt. I gripped the flashlight tightly, took a deep breath, and shouted, "Come out, I know someone's there." At that moment, a hoarse laugh echoed, reverberating through the dark space. The laugh was mocking and maniacal, as if someone was enjoying my fear. Suddenly, I saw a small, crouched shadow darting swiftly like a ghost, disappearing into the darkness at the end of the train. I shone my flashlight, but there was nothing but thick darkness. Damn it. I turned around to run back, but my legs felt frozen. Just as I turned, a loud thud sounded behind me. I glanced back and saw a larger shadow standing there, right in the middle of the carriage, only a few meters away. He was tall, looming like a ghost in the dark, his face obscured, but I could see his eyes glowing red in the darkness. I didn't hesitate, turned around, and ran with all my strength. The heavy footsteps of the stranger echoed right behind me, and I felt like he was closing in fast. The wooden planks under my feet creaked, and I could only dash straight toward the end of the train without daring to look back. His rapid, labored breathing sounded like it was right behind me. As I reached the end of the carriage, I leapt into another one, the door slamming against the train body, producing a deafening sound. The stranger's roar reverberated throughout the train. The sound resembled the scream of a wild beast, filled with rage and hatred. I didn't dare look back, only jumped out of the train and bolted to the ground. I tumbled onto the wet grass, but quickly got up and ran as fast as I could toward the edge of the forest. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My heart was pounding, my breath rapid, and my arms and legs felt like they were about to fall off. I sat in the car, trying to calm down and process what had just happened. But then, from deep within the forest, I saw a pair of red lights glowing in the darkness. I squinted to see more clearly, and was horrified to realize they were the eyes of the shadow standing in the middle of the train. I slammed the gas pedal and sped off, not daring to look back. I didn't know who or what that was, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go near that train station again. Perhaps something or someone is guarding that place, and anyone who steps in there at night will never leave safely. Those maniacal laughs and those glowing red eyes would forever haunt me in my nightmares. In all my years of working, this is truly the first time I've encountered a story that haunted me so deeply. I'm a maintenance worker who has been working for the city's elevated railway system for nearly 6 years. My daily duties usually include inspecting and repairing railway tracks and stations. Although I have worked in this environment for a long time, I have always felt a peculiar chill whenever I work alone at night. But what haunts me the most is an experience I had one summer night last year when I was assigned to perform maintenance on an abandoned elevated railway that had been out of use for a long time. This elevated railway was once an essential part of the city's transportation network, but it was shut down more than a decade ago. Most of the stations along the route were abandoned, with weeds growing all over the tracks, and the old streetlights were mostly broken. Only a few remained, flickering weakly in the night. I was sent to check and repair some electrical equipment along this line, a task that I thought would take just a few hours. That night, I arrived at the abandoned station in the middle of the route, the highest point on the old railway. The surrounding stations were shrouded in darkness, and only the cold wind whistled through the empty platforms. I began my work, inspecting each electrical pole and replacing the rusty control panels. The station was completely silent, not a soul in sight, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing on the metal floors of the deserted station. I sighed, trying to finish my task as quickly as possible. so I could leave this place. Everything was normal until I heard a loud screech coming from afar. It was the sound of metal scraping against metal, almost like someone was dragging a heavy object along the tracks. I stood still, straining my ears to listen, but the sound abruptly stopped, leaving behind a heavy silence. I told myself it was probably just the wind shaking the rails, but a sense of unease still crept into my heart. About 10 minutes later, as I was climbing up a pole to inspect the wiring, I heard that sound again. This time, it was clearer, louder, and it sounded like something or someone was clawing at the metal, as if trying to break the rails. I swallowed hard, staring at the dark corner of the station from where the sound seemed to come. I turned on my flashlight and shone it in that direction, but saw nothing except rusty metal sheets and the outline of abandoned carriages. Still, the eerie feeling didn't leave me. I quickly climbed down, determined to finish my work and get out of there as soon as possible. Just as I was about to complete the inspection, a faint cry echoed from the end of the railway. I froze. It was the cry of a child. There was no mistaking it. A child crying at this hour, in a place like this. My heart pounded. Maybe I was hearing things. But then the cry rang out again, this time clearer, as if the child was right next to me. I tightened my grip on my flashlight and cautiously moved toward the source of the sound. "Are you okay?" I shouted, hoping someone would answer. There was no reply. I slowly walked through the abandoned train carriages, my eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Suddenly, a weak voice whispered,
"Please, help me."
A chill ran down my spine. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. "Where are you?" I called out. After a brief silence, the voice came again.
"I'm right here. Just come straight ahead."
I didn't want to move forward, but I couldn't just leave a child behind either. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, one step at a time, my heart racing. When I reached an old carriage, my flashlight shone onto a small figure. A child standing in the middle of the tracks, facing away from me. I squinted, trying to see more clearly, and then I saw something that made me want to scream. Behind the child, there was another shadow. It was tall and massive, looming like a monstrous figure, standing silently in the darkness. It didn't move, but its eyes, blood red and glowing, reflected the beam of my flashlight, staring right at me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. Something was very, very wrong here. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, then slowly began to back away. The large shadow didn't move, but those blood-red eyes followed my every step. I turned and ran, my legs stumbling over the metal tracks, but I forced myself not to look back. My ragged breaths blended with the eerie wind whistling through the high railway. Just as I reached the entrance of the station, a scream rang out from behind me.
"Where are you going? Help me."
It was the child's voice. I didn't stop, didn't turn around, just ran straight for the exit. Only when I was out of the station and standing on the main road did I dare look back. The entire station was shrouded in darkness. There was no sign of the child, no red eyes glaring back at me. The police arrived shortly after. I recounted the entire incident, but they seemed skeptical. However, when they conducted a full investigation of the railway, they found something that made everyone shudder. A small child's hat lying alone on the tracks, right where I saw the shadow. The hat was stained with dried blood. The police believed that a terrible crime had occurred there, but they couldn't find any more clues. They concluded that there was someone or something lurking somewhere on that abandoned railway. I don't know who or what that figure was, or what the child really was. But if you ever hear a cry in the night from an abandoned elevated railway, never go looking. Some things are better left alone, for no one knows what's lurking in the darkness. And if you ever see those blood-red eyes, run and never look back. Even now, whenever I recall that night, my mind seems to whirl in an endless spiral of terror. Every detail, even the smallest one from that night, appears vividly before my eyes. I used to be a journalist, specializing in mysterious stories and supernatural phenomena. Over the years, I've ventured to many abandoned places, listening to tales of haunted houses, cursed roads, and eerie spirits. But nothing could have prepared me for what I faced one stormy night, when I decided to investigate a famous abandoned train known as the Midnight Ghost Train. This freight train once belonged to a major railway company, but after a horrific accident that claimed the lives of more than 20 workers, both the railway line and the train were permanently shut down. The story goes that the train became haunted by the souls of those who passed away tragically when it derailed on a stormy night, plummeting into a ravine and bursting into flames. Since then, it has been seen wandering on rainy nights. No passengers, no driver, just eerie sounds echoing throughout its decaying carriages. According to locals, if anyone happens to see the Midnight Ghost Train, it's a sign that death is imminent, a foreboding that cannot be avoided. I had explored many strange stories like this before, and my curiosity got the better of me. So I decided to investigate the rumor and head to the place where it was last seen. A deserted section of railway deep in the forest, far away from any roads or villages. That night, I brought all the necessary equipment: a camera, a camcorder, a voice recorder, and the brightest flashlight I could find. I believed that if I could capture any footage of the train, it would be a groundbreaking discovery that might unravel the truth behind the legends. I arrived at the location around 11 p.m., just as a torrential downpour began. The rain poured relentlessly, turning the dirt road leading to the railway into a muddy and slippery mess. Thunder rumbled in the pitch-black sky, and lightning flashed, illuminating the overgrown path through the dense forest. The atmosphere around me was cold and heavy, filled with an inexplicable sense of dread. I followed the narrow trail, carefully navigating through the dark woods according to the map I had marked earlier. I kept walking and walking, and finally, near midnight, I spotted the old railway hidden beneath thick, shadowy branches, covered in dry leaves and tangled vines. The rusty, cracked rails looked as if they had been abandoned for ages. The sight sent chills down my spine, but I told myself that I had come too far to turn back now. Just as I was hesitating, a faint light appeared in the distance, flickering through the thick fog. I squinted, trying to see more clearly. The pale blue light gradually revealed the shape of a long train, the dark carriages emerging ominously in the darkness. It was the Midnight Ghost Train. My heart pounded furiously. I quickly took out my camera, my hands trembling as I raised the lens. But just as I started filming, the train began to move, its wheels screeching against the rusty rails, reverberating through the stillness of the night. Without thinking, I ran towards the train, clutching my camera tightly, determined to capture every detail. A low, ominous whistle echoed through the deep woods, sending shivers down my spine. The train continued to move slowly along the track, then stopped just a few feet away from me. The heavy iron doors of the carriages creaked open slightly, as if inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity overcame my fear. I stepped into the first carriage. The stench of mold and something metallic hit my nose, almost making me gag. The faint beam of my flashlight shone on rows of empty, decaying seats covered in rust. Inside the carriage, time seemed to have stood still. The old seats were torn and rusty, the metal corroded and covered in dust. I carefully walked between the rows, sweeping my flashlight over every dark corner. But as soon as I reached the middle of the carriage, a strange sound echoed, a light but steady sound of footsteps coming from the end of the carriage. I froze, my heart pounding violently in my chest. The footsteps stopped immediately. I spun around, shining my flashlight behind me. Nothing but thick darkness. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the eerie stillness. There was no answer, but a cold breath brushed against the back of my neck. I turned around, and to my horror, I saw a faint figure appear on the opposite seat. It was a man, dressed in an old conductor's uniform, his face pale and his eyes hollow. He sat motionless, staring blankly at me. I stepped back, trembling, as more figures began to materialize, scattered across the seats. They all stared at me with empty, sorrowful eyes. Some of the ghosts bore horrific injuries, heads crushed, limbs broken, and blackened blood seeping from their wounds.
Leave.
A voice rasped, hoarse and angry. Panicked, I turned and tried to open the door, but it slammed shut. The train shuddered violently, as if mocking my desperate attempt to escape.
Get out.
The voice boomed, echoing throughout the carriage. The ghosts stood up, their footsteps pounding in unison. I rushed to the end of the carriage, slamming my fists against the door, hoping to break free. The door wouldn't budge. The spirits moved closer, their skeletal hands reaching out for me. Their faces twisted in a grotesque, haunting expression. In a fit of panic, I sprinted to the front of the carriage, my eyes darting around for an escape route. The left door was slightly ajar, and without a second thought, I threw myself against it. I tumbled onto the cold, hard ground, my head colliding painfully with a sharp piece of metal, but fear drove away the pain. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling, and started running along the tracks. Behind me, I heard the screeching of wheels as the train began to move, slowly but surely chasing after me. I ran frantically through the bushes, weaving through the tall grass, feeling the eerie blue light of the train's headlights shining on my back. I glanced back. Ghostly figures stood along the carriages, their hollow eyes fixed on me, and then they began to shriek. I didn't stop. I sprinted towards the tree line, slipping and stumbling on the wet ground. The sound of grinding wheels and the haunting cries of the ghosts seemed to be right behind me. I kept running, my vision blurred, my heart racing. I didn't care where the road led anymore. The rain continued to pour down, making each step heavier and slower. Behind me, I could still hear the relentless footsteps echoing through the woods. Finally, I reached my car. Without thinking, I jumped inside, started the engine, and sped away from that cursed place as fast as I could. I will never forget the sight of those hollow eyes, nor the eerie whistle that echoed through the storm. The midnight ghost train is still out there, wandering along abandoned tracks. And if you ever see it, turn around and run. Never look into those empty eyes. And never, ever board that train. Because if you do, you might never return. Perhaps this will be an experience I never want to talk about again. Due to the nature of my work, I've almost gotten used to taking the last subway home late at night. This city never sleeps, but the subway stations at night are a completely different story. That night, I learned that not every train will take you home safely. It was a typical Friday night. I left the office at 11 p.m. and hurried down to the subway station. Everything felt familiar. The quiet platform, the enveloping darkness, and only a few people standing silently, waiting for the last train. I always felt a sense of calm stepping into such a deserted space, a sense of serenity before returning home. The train arrived on time, its doors opening with a familiar hiss, and I stepped inside. I chose a seat near the window as usual, put on my favorite music, leaned my head against the backrest, and gently closed my eyes, letting myself relax. The train started to move, and everything seemed as ordinary as it always did during the final ride of the day. I leaned back in my seat, enjoying my music, and closed my eyes for a few moments of rest after a long, tiring day. But I didn't realize that this familiarity was only the beginning of a strange journey. About 15 minutes passed, and I woke up, glancing at the display board to check the next station. Suddenly, I realized that something was off. The digital screen above the door wasn't displaying the usual information. There was no next stop, X, or any station name at all. Instead, the entire screen was just a blank, dark space with a strange, blinking light. I checked my watch. It was 12:15 a.m. and realized that the train should have already stopped at my destination a few minutes ago. A sense of unease started to creep in. The train continued gliding through the thick darkness, showing no sign of stopping. The view outside completely disappeared. Only an empty void of darkness flashed past the window. I stood up, looked around. All the passengers who had been on the train with me seemed to have gotten off at the previous stations. Now, I was the only one left on the train. I didn't think too much of it at first, assuming they had simply reached their stops. Then, suddenly, the train began to slow down and gradually came to a full stop. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking I had finally reached my station. But when the doors opened, I froze. Outside was an empty, damp platform. The dim lights illuminated a vast space with old, peeling brick walls. There were no signs, no station names, no directional boards. Just a desolate, decayed place, as if it had been abandoned for a long time. The musty smell hit my nose, making me shiver. An odd feeling crept into every thought. Where is this? I muttered, trying to peer further outside, but everything was swallowed by the darkness. I hesitated, too scared to step out. A vague fear pressed down on my chest. The train doors remained open, as if inviting me to step out, but I didn't dare. There was something about this place that felt very wrong. The train began to move again. Outside the window, there was still only an all-consuming blackness. At that moment, I couldn't remain calm any longer. My heart pounded fiercely. My instincts told me I shouldn't stay here a second longer. I decided to run to the end of the carriage to try pressing the emergency button. But when I pressed it, all I got was static. No response. No one answered. I returned to my seat, my fear overtaking my mind. The train picked up speed again, plunging straight into the pitch-black void of the tunnel. No more stations appeared, no more stops. I stared at the display screen. It was still just a dark, empty space. I tried using my phone, but there was no signal. Nothing. I pounded on the glass door, shouting for help, but only the echo of my own voice reverberated through the empty carriage. Nothing changed. The train kept speeding along in the endless darkness, as if I had been sucked into a journey with no destination. I collapsed into my seat, trembling. I had no idea how long it had passed. I was utterly exhausted. Everything seemed to lose meaning. All I wanted was to get out of here, to escape from this train immediately, but every exit was blocked. Sometime later, the train slowed down and came to a halt once more. "Final stop. Please exit the train," the electronic voice announced. I was stunned. Final stop. I was still the only one on the train. The doors opened again, and I saw the faint light of yet another desolate platform. No signs, no names. The place looked as though it had been abandoned long ago. With no other option, I stepped off the train and ran as fast as I could toward the exit. I sprinted up the stairs, my heart racing. When I finally burst through the station doors and stepped into the streetlight, I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. I pulled out my phone. It was past 2 a.m. I had really escaped from that strange train. Since that terrifying night, I haven't dared take the subway again.